The Electoral College, its creation, questions, and answers. Episode 5.
The Electoral College is a process, not a place. The Founding Fathers established it in the Constitution as a compromise between election of the President by a vote in Congress and election of the President by a popular vote of qualified citizens. The Electoral College process consists of the selection of the electors, the meeting of the electors where they vote for President and Vice President, and the counting of the electoral votes by Congress. The Electoral College consists of 538 electors. A majority of 270 electoral votes is required to elect the president. Your state's entitled allotment of electors equals the number of members in its congressional delegation, 1 for each member in the House of Representatives, plus 2 for your senators. Read more about the allocation of electoral votes. Under the 23rd Amendment of the Constitution, the District of Columbia is allocated 3 electors and treated like a state for purposes of the Electoral College. For this reason, in the following discussion, the word state also refers to the District of Columbia. Each candidate running for president in your state has his or her own group of electors. The electors are generally chosen by the candidate's political party, but state laws vary on how the electors are selected and what their responsibilities are. Read more about the qualifications of the electors and restrictions on who the electors may vote for. The presidential election is held every 4 years on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. You help choose your state's electors when you vote for president because when you vote for your candidate you are actually voting for your candidate's electors. Most states have the winner-take-all system that awards all electors to the winning presidential candidate. However, Maine and Nebraska each have a variation of proportional representation. Read more about the allocation of electors among the states and try to predict the outcome of the Electoral College vote. After the presidential election, your governor prepares a certificate of ascertainment listing all of the candidates who ran for president in your state along with the names of their respective electors. The certificate of ascertainment also declares the winning presidential candidate in your state and shows which electors will represent your state at the meeting of the electors in December of the election year. Your state's certificates of ascertainment are sent to the Congress and the National Archives as part of the official records of the presidential election. See the key dates for the 2016 election and information about the roles and responsibilities of state officials, the Office of the Federal Register and the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, and the Congress and the Electoral College process. The meeting of the electors takes place on the first Monday after the second Wednesday in December after the presidential election. The electors meet in their respective states, where they cast their votes for president and vice president on separate ballots. Your state's electors' votes are recorded on a certificate of vote, which is prepared at the meeting by the electors. Your state's certificates of votes are sent to the Congress and the National Archives as part of the official records of the presidential election. See the key dates for the 2016 election and information about the roles and responsibilities of state officials and the Congress and the Electoral College process. Each state's electoral votes are counted in a joint session of Congress on the 6th of January in the year following the meeting of the electors. Members of the House and Senate meet in the House chamber to conduct the official tally of electoral votes. See the key dates for the 2016 election and information about the role and responsibilities of Congress and the Electoral College process. The Vice President, as President of the Senate, presides over the count and announces the results of the vote. The President of the Senate then declares which persons, if any, have been elected President and Vice President of the United States. The President-elect takes the oath of office and is sworn in as President of the United States on January 20th in the year following the presidential election. How did we get the Electoral College? The Founding Fathers established the Electoral College in the Constitution as a compromise between election of the President by a vote in Congress and election of the President by a popular vote of qualified citizens. However, the term Electoral College does not appear in the Constitution. Article 2 of the Constitution and the 12th Amendment refer to electors, but not to the Electoral College. Since the Electoral College process is part of the original design of the U.S. Constitution, it would be necessary to pass a constitutional amendment to change this system. Note that the 12th Amendment, the expansion of voting rights, and the use of the popular vote in the states as the vehicle for selecting electors, has substantially changed the process. Many different proposals to alter the presidential election process have been offered over the years, such as direct nationwide election by the people. But none have been passed by Congress and sent to the states for ratification as a constitutional amendment. Under the most common method for amending the Constitution, an amendment must be proposed by a two-thirds majority in both houses of Congress and ratified by 3/4 of the states. What proposals have been made to change the Electoral College system? Reference sources indicate that over the past 200 years, over 700 proposals have been introduced in Congress to reform or eliminate the Electoral College. There have been more proposals for constitutional amendments on changing the Electoral College than on any other subject. The American Bar Association has criticized the Electoral College as archaic and ambiguous. Its polling shows 69% of lawyers favored abolishing it in 1987. But surveys of political scientists have support continuation of the Electoral College. Public opinion polls have shown Americans favored abolishing it by majorities of 58% in 1967, 81% in 1968, and 75% in 1981. Opinions on the viability of the Electoral College system may be affected by attitudes toward third parties. Third parties have not fared well in the Electoral College system. Candidates with regional appeal, such as Governor Thurmond in 1948 and Governor Wallace in 1968, won blocks of electoral votes in the South. Neither came close to seriously challenging the major party winner, but they may have affected the overall outcome of the election. The last third party, or splinter party candidate to make a strong showing was Theodore Roosevelt. In 1912, progressive, also known as the Bull Moose Party. He finished a distant second in electoral and popular votes, taking 88 of the 266 electoral votes needed to win at the time. Although Ross Perot won 19% of the popular vote nationwide, in 1992, he did not win any electoral votes, since he was not particularly strong in any one state. Any candidate who wins a majority or plurality of the popular vote nationwide has a good chance of winning in the Electoral College, but there are no guarantees. See the results of 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, and the 2016 elections. How does the Electoral College process work in my state? For information on the Electoral College process in your state, contact the Secretary of State of your state. To find your Secretary of State, go to the website for the National Association of Secretaries of State, http://www.nas.org. May I attend the meeting of my state's electors to watch them vote? Generally, each state's electors vote at their respective state capitals. Each state determines whether or not the voting is open to the public. Find out if your state's meeting of electors is open to the public, and if so, what the process is to view the vote, and contact your governor's office or your Secretary of State. Also, find out if there's an online source listing the names and voting records of presidential electors for all previous presidential elections back to 1789. Who are the electors and how can I contact them? Each state and the District of Columbia will appoint the electors after it certifies the general election results. Each will then prepare a certificate of ascertainment, which will contain the names of the electors and the number of votes they received. Certificates of ascertainment may also contain the party affiliation for electors. They are posted as received from the states and announce them using Facebook and Twitter. You'll find the posted certificates on the web. However, we do not receive the names of the electors until we receive the certificates of ascertainment. To find out the names earlier, you would need to contact each state and the District of Columbia individually to request the contact information for their electors. The National Association of State Election Directors, N.A.S.E. D. Can help you find contact information for the states. Some states release the slates of all potential electors before the general election, and some states include the names of the potential electors on the general election ballot. How each state approaches these issues is up to the state. Whether or when a state releases contact or other information about the electors is also up to the state. Who verifies if a candidate is qualified to run for president? The Office of the Federal Register at the National Archives and Records Administration administers the Electoral College process, which takes place after the November general election. The Office of the Federal Register does not have the authority to handle issues related to the general election, such as candidate qualifications. People interested in this issue may wish to contact their state election officials or their congressional representatives. Because the process of qualifying for the election and having a candidate's name put on the ballot varies from state to state, you should contact your state's top election officer for more information. In most states, the Secretary of State is the official responsible for oversight of state elections, including the presidential election. Visit the National Secretaries of State website to locate contact information and web addresses for the Secretary of State from each state and the District of Columbia. What happens if the president-elect fails to qualify before inauguration? If the president-elect fails to qualify before inauguration, Section 3 of the 20th Amendment states that the vice president-elect will act as president until such a time as the president has qualified. The Constitution also directs Congress to determine by law a successive line of service to be called upon, in the unlikely occurrence that both the president-elect and vice president-elect fail to qualify by the beginning of the presidential term. Accordingly, Federal Law 3 Us. C. Section 19 states that, in order the following would be required, if qualified and, for cabinet secretaries, if having been confirmed by advice and consent of the Senate, to act as president until such a time as the president has qualified, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, the Secretary of the Interior, the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of Labor, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, the Secretary of Transportation, the Secretary of Energy, the Secretary of Education, the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, and the Secretary of Homeland Security. What happens if a candidate dies or becomes incapacitated? If that candidate dies or becomes incapacitated between the general election and the meeting of electors, individual states may pass laws on the subject. But no federal law prescribes how electors must vote in that situation. In 1872, when Horace Greeley passed away between Election Day and the meeting of electors, the electors who were slated to vote for Greeley voted for various candidates, including Greeley. The votes cast for Greeley were not counted due to a House resolution passed regarding the matter. See the full Electoral College vote counts for president and vice president in the 1872 election. As to a candidate who dies or becomes incapacitated between the meeting of electors and the counting of electoral votes in Congress, the Constitution is silent on whether this candidate meets the definition of president-elect or vice president-elect. If the candidate with a majority of the electoral votes is considered president-elect, even before the counting of electoral votes in Congress, Section 3 of the 20th Amendment applies. Section 3 of the 20th Amendment states that the vice president-elect will become president if the president-elect dies or becomes incapacitated. If a winning presidential candidate dies or becomes incapacitated between the counting of electoral votes in Congress and the inauguration, the vice president-elect will become president, according to Section 3 of the 20th Amendment. What happens if the states don't submit their certificates in time because of a recount? Title III of the United States Code establishes procedures for the Electoral College process and provides that states have until December 13,